Okay, I believe I have sound now. I think your sound was going through, just my sound was not going through. Okay, sorry guys. Once again, I believe you lost all the presentation I did from Rami. Thank you, Rami, for being here. Okay, I will just tell you about our partnership. This masterclass is promoted together with Scale Up Porto in the strategy of Porto's municipality in the development of entrepreneurial ecosystem. As a part of the strategy, and since the gaming market is growing and there's a lot of business opportunities here, we challenge Scale Up Porto to partner with IndieX and the Portuguese gaming community to foster this event. Okay, now they are telling me that you don't have sound. Okay, now you must have. Okay. Okay, let me check. They're saying. Okay, I think it's still not audible. Okay, can you check again? Desktop audio. Yep, I should as well. Okay. Nope, still not. Nope, I don't. That's not. Perfectly. Still no sound from Rami. You, you, you're in Holland? That's an.
Belgium for an hour or two, which is obviously just south of here. That's the only time I've been outside of the Netherlands in the past 8 months. Well, before I was in a different country every 3 days, which, yeah, it's been a little strange. But my Dutch is getting better again, which is nice. I definitely had developed an accent, like an American English accent, which is not great. But now my Dutch sounds Dutch again, and now I'm worried that my
Okay.
English doesn't sound English anymore. Does this sound good?
Yes, we are on. I believe we
We're
are on.
sound.
Okay.
Nice.
It's too loud.
Partners.
It's too loud now. Oh, okay. Try
Oh,
again.
I'm so sorry. Okay, yeah, no. So this is me. Hello. I was late for the audio visual test, which means that the issues that we're having now should have been resolved before the talk, but I couldn't find the login link for this call, so my bad. Hopefully the audio is good now, so that we can do the partner intro and then get started on this
Yes.
talk masterclass workshop thing.
Okay. We changed some things. Okay.
Mhm.
We can. Please, with no further ado, let's have Rami and masterclass.
Awesome. Hi, welcome. I think the partner that we were gonna mention was Scale Up Porto. So I don't know what the exact context of that is, but go check them out because they made this possible, apparently, or helped make this possible. Um, my name is Rami Ismail. I was asked to do a talk about game design, and I will happily do a talk about game design. I really wish I could have been there to just give the talk, to talk to you, to have conversations about what you all were working on or what you all were stuck with. I really enjoyed my time down there last year. It's only a year ago, but it feels so much longer. I don't want to do too much intro, so we're just going to go straight ahead because we've already lost a lot of time. So we're going to go. Today, I want to talk about 6 shapes or um, models that I think about when I'm working on the design of a game or making sure the design of a game doesn't get out of shape or doesn't get out of hand. Um, Before we continue with that, though, just a quick introduction of who I am. I'm Rami Ismail. I'm an independent game developer. I am the founder of former game studio Vlambeer. Um, you might know me from my travels around the world or my Twitter account or from the many, many talks that I've given over the years. So beyond being the founder of former game studio Vlambeer, I am also the executive director of the international games conference GameDev.world, the creator of the toolkit Du Press Kit, which is used by independent developers and AA developers around the world to create press kits for their video games. I helped establish the Indie Mega Booth in the early years. I'm a partner at Indie Fund, and I help out with the IGDA around the world. So, what are these 6 shapes I'm talking about? Well, the shapes are models, right? They're ways of thinking about um, about abstract ideas. And the problem with game design is that in many ways it is abstract. Game design is something that doesn't become concrete until you've made it, and until you've made it, all of it is in your head. The biggest problem with that for a lot of people, and I was not a game designer by trade. I'm a programmer by trade, right? I started at age 6 with my first computer, and I learned how to program over the next decade or so. Um, and the the thing that brought me to game design was that the thing I wanted to program was games, and I was a pretty terrible game designer for a very long time. Through my teens, I tried designing many a game, and they always got too big, or they overscoped, or they got out of shape. I couldn't find good focus on things, and I would always design so much. I would design entire worlds, I would design entire places, but I would never design a video game. And um, I couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong until much later, right? When I started Vlambeer, my co-founder was a guy named Jan Willem Nijman, and Jan Willem was an exceptional designer. What Jan Willem had done, opposite to me, by sheer luck or perseverance, was where I had started my game design journey, looking at bigger and bigger games. JW, when he started, joined a community of game designers that made very small games. In fact, they would sometimes do contests on a single day to make games. They would come back from school because they were mostly school kids in that community. Um, And they would challenge each other to make a game about a silly subject, like make a game about dogs chasing a car or something, right? And then they would do that in a few hours. They would make that game. They would make these tiny little prototypes, execute them, and then discard them to never be looked at again. Every now and then, a game from that community would go outside of its walls and end up on the internet, and those would be the very good ones. Now, Jan Willem, JW, he had gotten very good at designing games over those years because he was making a lot of games. And I mean a lot. He made hundreds and hundreds, and most of them were pretty terrible, admittedly. But every now and then, there was something wonderful in there. And that was already much better than where I was because I, with a lot of effort and a lot of pain over the course of a year and a half, would work on one game that would be okay-ish, right? And it wasn't until I saw JW work that I understood why. It was because JW was testing all the time. He was testing his ideas against reality all the time. And that doesn't necessarily even mean that he was testing it with people. No, he was testing it against the computer, against the device that the game would ultimately run on, which um, turned out to be really important because the problem that I was having was that the way your brains work, our brains are very, very good at filling in blanks, right? Just exceptionally good. Where computers are absolutely not. If I tell you that there's a castle in the clouds and that there's a warrior in sight about to fight a dragon, then your brain will have imagined that entire scene. Just take a second, imagine it. But you will, in your mind, see these clouds. You will, in your mind, see the castle, right? What kind of stones does the castle have? What kind of brick is the castle? What kind of color is the dragon? What kind of character is the warrior? Is it a knight? Probably a knight, or a mage. It's probably what you imagined. If you imagined like an astronaut with a jetpack, you have cooler imagination than I do. But the short version is computers are not good at that. If you try to take an idea from your brain and put it into a computer, that won't work because our brains can fill in blanks and computers cannot. So when you think the player moves from A to B, you imagine all of the cool stuff that the player will be doing, right? While in reality, moving from A to B is not that interesting unless you make it interesting. You imagine like, so the player fights a monster here, and you imagine all these cool behavior the monster has, um, and cool moves that the player does, but you've never actually tested if those are feasible or doable. So our imagination gets ahead of what computers can do all the time. And being able to just go and test against computers is probably the number one step a lot of people have to get through. Especially if you're a programmer, chances are that you're thinking very systemically. You're thinking in that way where you want everything to be complete before you get started. That's not how game design works. So I want to talk about 6 shapes that I figured out over the past decade of learning to be a better and better game designer. And I hope that these tools, some of them which are formal tools created by other people, some of them are tools made by myself. I hope that these shapes help you think about things in a way that helps you figure out your designs a little more. So these are the 6 shapes. If you recognize some of them, that's awesome. I'm sure some of you will have heard of some of these in different ways, shapes, and form. If you've done game theory studies, you will probably recognize the center, middle, the middle bottom one. But we're just going to go ahead because some of these have multiple meanings as well. We're just going to go through these. I'm going to try and see if I can make this work within 30-ish minutes and still leave some time for Q&A. But let's see how far we get for now. So there we go. So the first one. This one you might have seen me explain before if you've watched a lot of my talks, but I think this is an incredibly, incredibly important one. So at the heart of any interaction with a computer game, with a video game, is that the player is interacting with a program, right? With a game. And there is actually a very well-defined model or theory for how that interaction goes. And this theory has been expanded on by lots of really great design thinkers. Um, you have Raf Koster who expanded on this. You have Steve Swink who expanded on this. But at the base, I think the simplest version is probably the one you want to learn or you want to work from. I'm not sure if I can write, if you can see this, but nope, I can't write at the moment. Great. Um, Whenever I use Discord, that sometimes goes away. But okay, this one here. Imagine this is your player, right? So your player is in this corner, and this is where they are. They've got their input, which is in the bottom right here. You've got the game itself, and then you've got the output. So we have player, input, game, output. That is the simplest version of human-computer interaction when it pertains to games. You can expand this in 100 different ways, but at the heart, what you need to know is that the player is somebody with intent. It is a human. They figure out what they want to do, and then based on that, they will create an input. When they have that input, they press a button, or they pull a trigger, or they move the mouse, or whatever it is they do to interface with your game. Then the game takes that input and processes it. Now, not all of the processing is visible, right? Enemies that are moving outside of the range of sight, that are invisible to the player, that are behind the player, those are all being updated, but they're not necessarily being output, right? So this game is sort of a black box. The player doesn't necessarily have insight into everything what is happening. But it is important that the player knows what is important to them, right? That they understand what has changed about the simulation that is now a priority to them. And that's the output. With the output, we update the player with the methods we've given the player to make new decisions. Based on that, they'll update their intent. And when they update their intent, that changes what they're going to do with input. The easiest version I can explain of this is when a game boots up, right? When a game boots up for the first time, it loads up, the screen goes black, and a logo appears, and you probably want to skip that logo, right? So you're going to press the escape button. And then if the escape button works, you update your mental model. The player updates their intent to skip that logo by pressing escape every time in the future. If it doesn't work, then the player will recognize, okay, escape doesn't work. So now they're updating their mental model, and they're going to try spacebar, and then every other button on the keyboard to just make the logo go away. But they try the buttons, and when they realize it doesn't work, they just go grab a drink or something, right? So that the logos can continue cycling, and they come back, and the game is at the main menu stage. That is the very simplest version of this. But in reality, in a game, players are doing this, many times a second, right? Every time the screen updates, every time feedback comes back, they're updating what they want to do and how they want to do it. Depending on where they see the enemies are, depending on where they see items are, depending on what they know will happen to those items, are those items going to disappear? Are they going to stay around? If they're going to disappear, they might want to hurry towards them. If they're going to stay, they might want to clean out the environment first. If it's a racing game, whether there's a sharp turn coming up, do they remember the sharp turn? Is the map showing the sharp turn? Based on that, the player is updating their intent all the time, and their intent then steers their input updates the black box, and the black box updates the output, right? So a question I always ask designers that I explain this is, so where does the game actually happen, right? You've got the player here, you've got the input here, you've got the game here, and you've got the output here, but where is gameplay actually happening? And you can have a huge discussion about this, but the honest reality is that the game is always taking place in the player's head, which comes with some interesting implications. Because if the game is not the artifact itself, if the game is not just your software, but it is what the player understands of it, then a lot of things suddenly become a little different, right? We're not designing for a game anymore. We're designing for how the player experiences the game. One thing that is given to us, one affordance, one allowance that we have as designers that is only true because of that, is that we can cheat. We don't have to be exactly honest about what is happening in a video game, as long as it has the intended effect on the player. Which is why in a lot of games you will see little cheats in favor of the player. You will see a lot of games that do little tricks to make the player feel a little cooler or a little better or a little happier. The biggest example of that is probably Coyote Time, which is based on the Roadrunner cartoons with Wile E. Coyote, where when Wile E. Coyote runs off a platform or is about to fall, he will hover for a second, look at the camera, and then fall out of the screen, right? A lot of platformers actually use the same trick, where when a player runs off a platform, they're technically not supposed to jump anymore, because you can only jump when you're touching a platform, right? When you're standing on a platform. That's the only time jump will get registered. A lot of games will actually give you a few milliseconds of space after you leave a platform to still jump. Is that fair? No, but people don't want fair games. They want fair feeling games. It's why when a drop has a 10% chance of falling or occurring after a really difficult boss fight, most games will make sure that after you beat the boss 10 times, you have a higher chance of getting it than 10%. Because people's way of thinking about chances is pretty broken. When you tell people it's a 10% chance, they expect that in 10 times, you should get the item. While in reality, a 10% chance just means that every time you play it, you have a 10% chance, which might mean you never get it, right? That is an absolute possibility with a 10% chance. So a lot of games actually cheat in favor of the player because, again, the game is not taking place in the game. It doesn't have to be fair. It takes place in the player, which means it just has to feel fair. The other thing this model is great for is when you are, so I'll go through it one more time actually. So the player, the input, the game, and the output. And the output is anything, right? Sound, image, text, haptic feedback, enemy positions, goal, objective positions, objective communication, your walking speed, anything that the player can see happen or hear happen or feel happen is part of output. And anything you output will update the player's intent or their feeling about it. The other thing this is useful for is it is also just the base shape of how iterative design should work, right? So when you're designing something, you start by ideating. You come up with ideas, and this is a pretty open phase. You're just coming up with ideas, and you're kind of mentally sorting through them, going, okay, that sounds cool, that sounds fun, that sounds interesting. If you're doing this in a team, this is a really good moment to tell your team to not try and be too negative or dismiss ideas right away. You're exploring. Ideation is very much about exploring. You have a problem, you want to make a game, or the players are not aggressive enough, or players are not understanding a certain puzzle. They ideate solutions, right? So you come up with ideas on how to solve that. And instead of cutting down every idea straight away, you just kind of explore the possibility space of that idea. And then eventually you go to prototyping, which is you pick some of the ideas that sound most reasonable or most likely to work. You prototype them. And when you prototype them, you try to make this just the shittiest, simplest version of it, right? You don't try to make this good. You don't try to make it proper. You don't try to write proper code per se. You just try and test. You try to save time on this because you'll probably be prototyping a lot. So you prototype your ideas. After you prototype your ideas, you test them. You validate them. You make sure that they work. If they work, that's great. Like if they solve your problem, that's great. That doesn't necessarily mean you're done. You do want to check if other ideas might also work or even work better. And then when you figured out what you want to do, when you're done with prototyping, you're done with ideation, you're done with prototyping, you're done with validating, you implement. You choose the thing that works best, you implement it into your game, and then you go back. What is the next problem? At Vlambeer, we very often kind of refer to that last step as plumbing. When you're designing something, eventually something will break or not work the way you want. And we always designed, Jan Willem was a designer with incredible momentum. So when he was on a streak for something, we just kind of keep going until he ran into a problem that he couldn't solve with that momentum. And that was when plumbing would happen: fix the leaks, fix where water was like pooling up, and then continue. Um, so for Vlambeer, the model worked exactly the same, just ideation, prototyping, and validation. Instead of doing it for a single thing at a time, we did it for as many things at a time until we kind of got stuck and then had to go back. That was usually when our design discussions would happen, and when we would just try and figure out what was wrong and how to solve it. In some cases, that meant putting the game away. In some cases, that meant we gave up on a game idea. Our game Nuclear Throne, which was our most recent release, we started on that 4 or 5 times, but we never could figure out. It was a top-down roguelike. We never could figure out how to stop players from running from the entrance to the level to the exit of the level, and then just skipping all the combat, skipping all the fighting. So we tried all sorts of things. We tried stronger enemies. We tried making it hard for players to get by them, but it just made the game less fun rather than more fun. Until on the 4th attempt or something, JW came with the idea of just making the door appear when all the enemies were dead. So there wouldn't even be a door to run to until all the enemies were defeated. That took a long time to come up with that solution, but it fixed everything, and we made the game from that position, right? So the line is an interesting one because it's something I use. I don't think it's a formal game design tool or anything, but I use the line for a lot of things, and I mostly use the line when I need to categorize thoughts or I need to block off certain things. And the line for me is really useful because it is how I imagine the design process working in my head. So if you have a piece of paper and you can put a dot anywhere on the piece of paper, or you can write a word anywhere on a piece of paper, that's a lot of places you can put that word on, right? So imagine your possibility space, right? The directions you can take your idea to be an infinite piece of paper. The first thing you'll need to do is sort of create constraints for yourself, create rules to make that possibility space smaller. And I mentally kind of imagine that doing that by drawing a line somewhere. If I decide like, okay, this is going to be X genre, or the camera is going to work in this way, or now you've already made that paper much smaller because you're drawing these lines of like, okay, so this part, this is third person, we're doing first person. So that I did, it's a platformer, so it's not a racing game or a flight simulator or whatever, so we can get rid of all that space. And then you're just kind of making that space smaller. And that's actually great because ultimately where you want to go is you want to go to a point. You want to go to one specific place of where your game is going to be. Imagining that as like, okay, we're taking away design space is actually a really helpful way of doing it because it sort of reminds you that you are making progress even when there is nothing concrete to show, right? The idea that we have to create something to show progress isn't necessarily true. Sometimes you have to take opportunities away or take ideas or possibilities away to make progress. And that's also completely valid, right? I know a lot of people have this pressure of immediately getting to the prototyping. But there is something to be said to sort of have like an idea or a constraint space to work with. Vlambeer actually had predefined constraints. We had a constraint that any button you press needs to have a reason to let go of it again. So You can see that very elegantly in Luftrausers, where shooting is the X button. But if you want to repair your airplane, you have to let go of shoot. So you can't shoot while you want to repair. You can't repair while you're shooting. So you really have to choose between being offensive or on the run, right? And the same thing with accelerating. If you press forward, you can only fly in that direction. The only way to shoot behind you is to let go of the accelerant and then flip the airplane backwards and shoot behind you as you're falling. That was just kind of a rule that we had at Vlambeer. It was never formalized, it was never explicitly said, but we never started with the infinite piece of paper. We always had sort of this predefined space of a number of rules that we had that allowed us to just move faster because now we could. The other thing I use this for is when I'm really dreaming too much, when my ideas are too big, or when I'm trying to analyze a game and how it works. Is I try to use the line to separate nouns and verbs. So verbs are actions the player does or takes, and nouns are things the player does those actions to, or objects in the world, or like certain feelings that the game is trying to evoke in the player. But having a separation of the verbs, like the actions the player is doing, versus the effects or the location or the environment the player is doing that in, really helps for some reason. So I can actually recommend doing that exercise with some of your favorite games, because you will find that a lot of genres actually have pretty defined verbs. Like they're pretty similar across all of those games, whether they're indie or AAA. Um, Researching work in the spaces you're working in is very helpful, and I actually find this a pretty helpful way of doing that. So this model is another model I came up with myself, and to just run you through it, this is basically 4 concentric circles. Each of them is slightly larger, and we're going to start here at the center. The center is the core of an idea. It's the nugget. I teach a lot of pitching, which I think you have another workshop on pitching today or later, or maybe it already happened, by Gwen, if I'm not mistaken. Gwen Frey is phenomenal, and I can really recommend her talk. But one of the things you'll learn is that it's important to be able to get to the point of your game. What is special about your game? What is interesting about your game? That is the core of your game. That is the heart of it. And you need to be able to define that core in very simple terms. The more complicated the core gets, honestly, the harder your game will be to understand. So the core can be as simple as a feeling you want to evoke, right? The best fighter pilot in the world for Luftrausers. Or a progression type, right? Ridiculous Fishing, which was one of our earlier games, was built around the idea of continuously positive reinforcement. No matter how bad you were at the game, you always had to make progress. If you grabbed your phone and you just kind of like put it against your cheek a bunch of times, you would still have to make progress. And Ridiculous Fishing was kind of built around that notion. It doesn't necessarily have to be just one core, but I would really recommend trying to figure out if there's like a singular point, a singular goal, a singular heart of your game, because it'll make everything else easier. Now, the circle around that is your mechanics. These are the things that the player interacts with, the things the player does, the verbs, if you will, of your game design. And now the trick with this model is that those mechanics have to point back at your core. So every mechanic you add here, you can write it wherever you want. You need to be able to just kind of draw an arrow back towards the core, right? Just go like, okay, so it's a racing game about going fast. So we have a turbo mechanic. So you put that here. Or it's a game about chaos. So there's a mechanic that creates explosions or rubble or whatever, like something that makes things chaotic. You need to be able to point that back, right? So you kind of go through that. You write down all your mechanics, all your verbs, all the things the player can do or interact, or all the interactions the player has, all the affordances the player has. You need to be able to draw them back to the core. If you can't draw it back to the core, really start thinking about why that mechanic is there. What's the point of it? How does it support your core, the heart of your game? And it might be, that's the one exception, it might be that a certain mechanic was created as support for a second mechanic, in which case you draw the arrow that way, right? But then the mechanic it points to will point back at the core. You want to keep that second circle kind of elegant. You want to keep it as simple as possible. Obviously, any reasonably sized game will have quite a number of mechanics, but as long as they're supporting mechanics that point back at the core of your game, or they directly point back at the core of your game, you should generally be fine. As soon as you have mechanics that point to mechanics that point to mechanics that point to mechanics that point at the core of your game, you might be overcomplicating things a little. Now, around that, we have the feedback. And the feedback, if you remember the first model we talked about, that's everything that's communicated back to the player. Which means that in the feedback is a lot of stuff that would otherwise not be part of mechanics, right? There's how the environment or the art or the music makes the player feel. There's how the UI makes the player feel. There's how the sound effects of walking make the player feel. And now all of those would generally have to point back at either the mechanics or directly back at the core, right? So certain choices you make in terms of how the game looks or how the game sounds will directly point at your mechanics, and your mechanics should technically point back at your core. So most of these just should create this beautiful straight line or sort of like an arrow back at your core. And if you can make your game fit that model, you're already in a very good space. You're already in a very good place. Now, again, this is not just you say it's true. You have to make sure that it's true, which means that means testing, it means prototyping, it means making mock-ups, and it means playtests, right? But if indeed that model ends up looking like that, like these arrows that are all streaming back towards the heart of your game, you're making an elegant game. This is more of a mental exercise, honestly, that you can do to keep checking. If something doesn't feel right, see if you can fit this in this model. Very frequently, when we would discuss things at Vlaambeer, I would be making one of these just to make sure that the things we were discussing made sense to me and that they made sense to the game. Then the final layer out here, I call that meta. I don't really have a real good name for it, but it's basically everything around the game. It's your marketing, it's your main menu, it's the boot up screens, it's the leaderboards, if you have leaderboards, right? It's sort of that layer around the game that is still very important. That too needs to point back at anything on the inside. So it needs to point back at the aesthetic or at the mechanics or at the core of the gameplay. And as long as you can make everything point back towards the heart of it, it works. The one thing you want to avoid is that it's pointing in the complete opposite direction. If you have a game about going fast, making a character that has slow motion, it's just pointing radically in the wrong direction, right? It's just pointing away. And at that point, you have to be willing to cut something or to remove it or to adjust it so that it fits the go fast again. So this model I find very helpful, and it might be helpful for you to just do the same thing for your game at any point during development. No, this one is purple. That's actually really hard to see. So these could be two different things. The most famous one of this is the Dunning-Kruger curve, which is the how much do you know versus how much you think you know. That's not relevant to game design per se. It's just relevant to having skills. What I want to talk about is flow theory by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who came up with this idea of flow being a state that people can be in. And you basically imagine this graph having an axis that is challenge and an axis that is player ability or skill. And the basic notion of this one is extremely simple, so we're not going to spend too much time on this one. But the idea is that if you have player skill, and you have the challenge of the game, that if the challenge of the game is much higher than the player's skill, the player is going to get frustrated. And if the player's skill is much higher than the ability of than the challenge of the game, then the player is going to get bored. And there is sort of a state here where the challenge of the game fits what the player wants to be, what the player's skill is in that specific game. where the game creates flow. And flow is a state in which people get lost in the game, where people enjoy the game and kind of the world around them falls away. That is where we're aiming for as game designers. That doesn't mean that every game needs to have this beautiful 45-degree like skill increases at the same rate as challenge. No, there's actually sort of a channel around it. There's space around it. Like here is probably still fine. It's just a hard game. Here it's probably still fine. It's just sort of an easy game, right? I want to separate really quickly difficulty from accessibility. I know we have this discussion in the games industry all the time. I want you to remember that accessibility has nothing to do with difficulty. If you look at the recent release, Disc Room, by my former co-founder, that game is incredibly hard, incredibly challenging, also extremely accessible. You look at Celeste, by at the time Matt Makes Games, nowadays XOK. That game is incredibly hard, but also incredibly accessible. If you want to read more about making accessible games, go to accessible.games. That is accessible.games. And you'll be introduced to an idea called APX, which APX are these little cards, effectively, of game design tricks that you can use that will make your game better. But not just will they make your game better, they will also make your game more accessible. Ideas like making sure that every important element from your game gets output back to the player across 2 channels. So don't just communicate via visuals, also communicate via sound. Don't just communicate via sound, also communicate via visuals. This is good design. You don't want to shoot a gun in a game and then only see it, right? You also want to hear it so you know what kind of weapon you're firing. You don't want to jump and not hear it. Most good design things in games feedback via at least 2 channels, sometimes even via 3 if you use haptics. And APX just posits that, just suggests that as a good design rule. But then it also explains that if you do that, deaf people can now play your game. Hard of hearing people can now play your game. People that are blind can now play your game. People that have a bad eyesight can now play your game. So instead of saying like, okay, here's how you make the game more accessible to this group of people, it just goes, here's how you make your game better and include as many people as possible. So if you want to check that out, check out accessible.games. It's really a phenomenal website, and I recommend it, especially early in your project. If you're working on a project right now, look at it, see what you can still do. But if you're starting work on your next project, try and see how many of those cards you can implement, because it will really make your games better, and it will make your games more accessible. But to go back to flow theory, it doesn't mean that every game needs to look like this, right? You can have a chill game that kind of goes like that. You can have a really hard game that kind of like sits here. Those are all possible. I think the one thing that's important about this is that you're somewhere aware of what you're making. So this one is a bit more of a complicated one. This is the Mda Framework, which is the Mechanics, Dynamics, Aesthetics Framework. This is something that you can research for a lot of time, but the heart of it is you try to avoid words like fun and gameplay, and you try to be a little bit more specific. There's lots of explanations about what you want to use. But the one thing that I found when I was reading about the MDA for the first time, I was researching it, that I was finding it kind of complicated to really grab it. Like, what is this mechanics? What are dynamics, to be precise? What are aesthetics, right? And they kind of explain aesthetics as like, okay, so it's a sensation or a fantasy or a narrative or a challenge. Like it's the aesthetics of the game, the feelings it evokes in the player, whether they're expression or discovery or again challenge or a social construct like fellowship. So imagine aesthetics are here and dynamics are here. Dynamics are sort of like when the game is being played, how the mechanics create sort of a road to those aesthetics, right? So you have your mechanics here. Then the dynamics are when the game is being played, how do those mechanics affect the aesthetics, the experience, the player? And then the aesthetics is sort of like the overall feeling or challenge or way of interacting that the game creates. I was like, okay, I get that, right? You have your mechanics, the things the player does, the actions, the behaviors, the controls, the rules. You mix those with the content, which is the level, the assets, all that. And then that creates certain dynamics, right? Ways of interacting, ways of behaving, ways of making the player feel. Those then lead to a certain aesthetic to your game, a certain flavor, a certain like feeling. But what is the biggest use of knowing this? Because I think at heart we know that's kind of how it works. Well, the first thing is a framework is useful to just test your game against. Like, do our mechanics like indeed create these dynamics? Which mechanics do not create these dynamics? But I think the thing that I found most useful is when somebody explained this to me through a completely different lens. They said, well, imagine that you as a developer are here, right? And that the player is here. When you are creating this game, you're looking at this through in this direction. So you're looking at the mechanics first. You're looking at the rules. You're looking at um, the the mechanics. You're looking at the interactions. You're looking at the verbs, and then you're kind of trying to imagine or test what kind of dynamics that creates. And then the dynamics sort of lead to the aesthetic that you want to evoke in your player, right? Now, the player is looking at this through the completely different direction. They're looking at it through the aesthetics first. So they're looking at how the game looks, how it makes them feel, the sort of challenge that it's creating for them, or the mode of play that it's invoking in them. And then they're looking at that through the dynamics because they're looking at it, okay, so what can I do to affect a certain thing? Like what kind of activities should I do? What should I be focusing on? Then they're doing those things through the mechanics. And that draws back to us. So we're looking at it from completely different angles. And I actually found that incredibly helpful in trying to figure out how to design, where to design, when to design, what to focus on, what to not focus on. Because ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to invoke this as creators. We're just trying to find ways to get there, right? So these models might sometimes suggest that the only place that's worth thinking is verbs. And I want to emphasize that that is absolutely not the case. Like, yes, your verbs are incredibly important because it's the entry point for us. The verb is where we start our journey towards the player. But that doesn't mean that those are our goal. Our goal is always to invoke a certain feeling in the player, to invoke a certain sense in the player. Again, if the player believes something is true, then that is true. And that is where we're trying to get. That is the one way I found this MDA framework really helpful in just trying to remember, like, okay, we're looking from the one side and they're looking from the other side. How can we use these two to get there? Because the player's thinking, okay, I've got this. How can I use this by doing these to get there again, like to get to progress? I'm running out of time, which is good because this last one is actually more of a broader point. When we talk about game design, very frequently, especially for people that are not designers or are not practice designers, we really quickly feel like design is magic, right? And a little bit of it is. A little bit of it is science. A little bit of it is these models. A little bit of it is just things that happen, right? And I want to remind you that being a good game designer has nothing to do with playing lots of games. It has nothing to do with knowing everything about every game that's out there. It's not being able to name where a certain mechanic happens. No, being a good designer means that you have a lot of everything in your head because they say everything is a remix, right? But they don't mean everything is idea A plus idea B. They don't mean everything is a racing game plus a shooting game. Not everything is a combination of a certain song with a certain mechanic. Um, it's not. What they mean with everything is a remix is that everything is a combination of all the thoughts and ideas we've had in our lives. And sometimes that creates very interesting ideas. It creates very strange ideas. Um, But the more you keep your inspiration at one thing, the more likely you are to make things that are like that thing. So I would recommend that if you are to make games, if you are to be a game designer, if you are to design stuff, that you try to figure out this here, this line here, that's everything you know. And when you're thinking, your brain is just going through the everything you know, whether that is reading books, watching movies, writing books, writing stories, um, listening to music, going skydiving, going on travel, learning to cook, learning to make clothes, fashion, whatever it is, whatever your inspirations are. Um, See that I use the word inspiration. These are not inspirations necessarily. They're just things you're doing in life. They become inspirations to you because you've done these kinds of things. So sometimes people ask me how to become a better game designer, and I tend to answer go skydiving because not a lot of people have gone skydiving. And I don't mean you have to go skydiving, it has nothing to do with that. It just means that go do something. Go do anything else but making games. Because making games is important. Obviously, it's practice, it's exercise, it's a craft. You have to practice it. But if that's all that you're doing, you're not going to end up making interesting games. So try to expand this line here, the everything you know, and then as you're creating your game, as you're going through the possibility space, at some point your brain will go like, well, what if? And it's technically just drawing this line, right? Well, what if I make a game about the sense of falling? Right? I went skydiving, and the feeling of falling towards the earth was interesting. So, okay, like what can I make a game about that? Okay, so now we're drawing the line. We're trying to create that distinction. Now we have an aesthetic. Okay, so it's about this feeling. We have sort of a core, so we can start going from there. And now you continue down. Okay, so it's a game about falling. What kind of game it is? First person, third person, puzzle game, action game? Like what is this mechanic doing? And you might update the score because now the idea is growing. You might start thinking about, okay, how does this fit in this model? And as you continue, this possibility space keeps getting smaller and smaller. You keep drawing these lines. Okay, it's this, it's not that, it's this, and eventually you end up at an idea, right? And all the while you're prototyping, you're designing, you're trying, you're testing, um, and eventually you'll end up at a thing, like at a point. And that point, that's your core, that's the heart, that's where your game begins. And from that point on, you just go through that design loop. You ideate, you prototype, you validate, you implement, you make video games. Obviously, that's a very simplified ending to this talk, but I thought focusing on the first part of design, the ideation, would probably be the most helpful, because I know that out of a lot of things, when people have momentum, they keep that momentum. It's that early part of defining their game where people sometimes get stuck. And not having the answers to these shapes makes a lot of things harder. It makes marketing your game harder. It makes pitching your game harder. Um, it makes coming up with the art style, the music, the sound. It makes all of those things harder because these models force you to define and to test. And if I've learned anything about game design over the past 10 years, it is that those two things are probably the most important things you can do. You want to be able to define your work, right? And to make decisions about your work. So that was it. Six shapes of game design that will help you make your video games. I hope this was useful to you. I will make sure to, I want to mention accessible design, accessible games one more time. If you want some expansion on some of these, I can recommend the books by Raf Koster and Steve Swink. I would look those up. I will make sure that those get put in the chat or on a tweet or something with the details. So if you want to check them out, you can check them out. That was it for me. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that was useful, and make some games.
Thank you, Rami, for this wonderful masterclass. We have already linked in the chat the site for accessible games.
Awesome.
So, and do we have time for a couple of questions?
I have time for a couple of questions. So if you have time for a couple of questions, then yes, absolutely.
Okay, so we have Pedro asking, as a game designer, do you think it's hard to start, and if there's it's too late for you to enter the market place.
Right. I mean, that's a question I get a lot, and the answer is no, it's not. It's not too late to enter the market. Like, the reality is, it's a hard market, right? Like, it's not an easy place to be in. But when you look at what's happening, there's a few players that stay around, right? That stick around, that are there, and that continue to be there. But in general, the groups that are making the hits tend to change up pretty frequently. Now, the hits is not what you should be aiming at anyway. Like, and at risk of this turning into a little bit of a business lecture, instead, is when you think about it, your goal shouldn't be to make a hit game. Your goal should just be to make games, like in plural, like multiple games. Your goal should be to make this one game, and then at the end of it, have enough money to make the next one. And I can guarantee you that there's very few hit studios. There is an enormous number of studios that are pretty successful, right? Like, they're not making tons of money, but they're sustainable and they continue to operate. They continue to make games, sometimes mostly invisible to us because they're not big in the press. They're not being played by Twitch streamers all the time. But a good idea with good execution always stands a chance, even if sometimes it takes a while. Like, you look at Among Us, that game came out 2.5 years ago by now. Nobody cared, and now suddenly it's the biggest thing in the universe. But you look at smaller games with smaller audiences that just make enough to continue making games. If you can hit that, you're a successful game developer.
I will add up to that question for myself.
Right.
Do you believe that growing older it somehow slows your creativity and ability to create
Right.
games?
I don't think so. Some of the most creative people I know are like 50 or 60 years old. Even in this industry, I find that being older for me at least, it means that I just have seen more. I've come across more things. I've tried more things. So maybe it's not that you're less creative. You have a higher chance of your brain going like, "Oh, that's a terrible idea. I've seen that before, done that before." I think your biggest challenge getting older is to get rid of that voice that tells you, "Oh, that's a bad idea. Oh, we shouldn't do that." Because I know that I was far less cynical about game ideas 10 years ago than I am now. Like, I'm a lot more careful with what I do or why I do things.
So it's
I don't think. Sorry.
it's an advantage and a cross at the same time.
Right, it's both of those at the same time. Your state of life is different. You probably have more responsibilities to take care of. So you're going to be a little bit more picky about the designs you actually implement. The biggest worry I have with that is that you allow fewer ideas to get to the stage where you're testing. So I think the important thing is to not be too cynical about early ideas and be a little bit more careful about what you implement. But that model that we talked about here in the top left, that perfectly emphasizes that you ideate, you prototype, you validate, and you implement. Up until validate, you shouldn't be killing ideas, really. Like, maybe before prototyping, you get rid of all but the best ones. But until you've prototyped, like, you shouldn't be making decisions like that.
Okay, and with that in mind, Nuno Marx asks, when you're choosing between a game ideas to prototype on, do you go with what you think will be more successful, or you do what interests you most?
I tend to kind of sit in the middle on that one. So my hard rule is that if we were a small team at Flambeer, but all the games I consult on, all the games that I worked on, all the games that I've special thanks or whatever on, in which I collaborated in the design process or in the ideation process. The honest truth is that the most important thing to me is figuring out what is interesting to make. I don't even care whether it's interesting to play all that much. Like, I don't like all of the games we've made at Flambeer. Some of them are in genres I just don't necessarily enjoy. And they were all a little harder than the games that I tend to play or love. But the thing is, they were fun to work on. And I think that is the golden ticket that I'm looking for, because I firmly believe that if you're making a game that you find interesting, right, that you find new or enticing or in some form or shape, like a stimulating idea, that's not just true for you. There's going to be thousands or tens of thousands of people out in the world that are also fascinated by that. And when you look at a lot of the most popular game ideas, they were not created to be the most popular game ideas. They were created because somebody genuinely believed this was missing, or I want to play a game like this, or I want to make a game like this. And the success comes from taking marketing, taking business, taking budgeting, taking dealings very seriously. But at the heart of the game, I think you should always find it an interesting game first, and then figure out how to make it successful. Like making games is hard enough. Staying motivated is hard enough. Working on a game you hate, it's just not going to go well.
Of course, even more so. So, and Enrique Basto is asking, do you find that not playing video games is an impediment to becoming a game designer, or it's a strength not to be formatted by the current industry? You kind of answered already, but
I think there are different ways of being the same thing, right? Like you can be a game designer with very little gaming experience, and it means that you're free of a lot of limitations and ideas that you might have otherwise. Or you can be a very experienced game player and be aware of all the solutions that people have already found. You'll avoid recreating the wheel or reinventing the wheel when the wheel really is like it's kind of perfect. Like, don't get me wrong. There's probably improvements you can make to the wheel, but the basic idea of a wheel is it's round and it rolls. Like it's pretty good at what it does. That said, like I personally, the way I do it is I play a lot of games. I'm honestly playing a lot of games. I just finished 3 games yesterday that I've been playing over a period of time, and yeah, one of them I didn't actually finish. I just quit. I felt I was pretty secure in knowing what it was trying to do and how it was trying to do it. But I play them as research, right? Like I'm trying to figure out what the game does, how the game works. I'm trying to figure out this model. I'm trying to figure out that model. I'm trying to figure out like what decisions they might have made early on in their process or how the game came to be. I love trying to figure out whether the lead, the creative lead on a game is a programmer or a designer or an artist. You can usually tell from the final game what their background was, or sound or any other discipline.
but
I find that really fun.
you are also playing because you have fun. Exactly. That's
Well, yeah, but I find that really fun. Like that's the weird thing. Like I don't play games the way a player does. I can't. Like there's no way for me to do that anymore because I've seen behind the curtain. I know how it works, right? Like I load a level and I go like, wow, that was a fast load. Like I can guarantee you that no player that is not a developer is looking at that load screen and going like, how are they streaming that data? Like, is this in chunk? Like, what are they doing here? How is that so fast? Like, most players don't look at the hallway that goes right, left, left, right, and goes like, okay, so they're doing some loading, and we're not looking at sprites and going like, how's that billboarding done, right? Like, that's just not how people play games. Like, that's how game developers play games. I love it. I have a ton of fun playing games that way, and every now and then a game gets me so good that I'm like really playing a video game again. But that's rare. Like the majority of the time, I'm playing games and I'm loving playing games. But I'm loving playing games because I love game development and I love seeing the tricks and the craft and the expertise of my colleagues and my fellow game developers. Um, I love that. I love a good sequence. Like you're in a game and this sequence of things happens and you're just like, wow, perfectly drew my eye, super impressive. The sound was so good. I'm just sitting there just being like, I'm just amazed at what beautiful stuff we can create as developers. I don't care to play as a player. Like they're who I create for. I want to create beautiful things for them. I can't play like them anymore, and I'm super fine with that. I'm super fine with that. I get this beautiful other way of looking at this, and I think of it like musicians, right? Musicians love music, but they can hear every line in the bass. They can hear every like chord progression. They can hear, and they find beauty in that. They find beauty in that expertise. Yeah, they're still listening to music. They're not listening to it the
the
same way
same
I
way.
am, with barely any idea of what any of those words mean. Um, it's all beautiful. As long as you're still finding beauty in games, play games. Like that's it.
Okay. We still have one more.
Sure.
What do you consider is a core principle in design to make the game not feel soulless? A game can have realistic graphics and sometimes look empty, while some smaller games can feel much more immersive in terms of world design, for example.
Right. That is a very difficult question because soul is relatively undefined. It's one of those things where we all recognize it when we see it, but we have no idea where it comes from. The thing that I can tell you is that games that are made, the games that feel soulful to me, right, tend to have very clear ideas of what they're going for, especially in this model over here. Um, Games that are soulful, they feel like they have a heart, they have a core, right? Like a thing that works, that everything points back to, right? Like a joyful game has joy everywhere. Like the plants, like have a little cute bounce. The clouds, they look happy. Um, a good driving game, everything feels fast, everything feels sharp, everything feels cool. Like every game sort of has these core, these nuggets, these seeds at the heart of them. And I feel like a soulful game, everything points back inwards. I think the more points back towards the center, the more soulful it looks. But the other half of that answer is that part of it is just a little magic, right? You can do everything right and still end up with a game that just feels just a tiny bit off or something didn't click together. And um, sometimes that's as simple as a sound effect. Sometimes that's one of my favorite game design stories is about this multiplayer first person shooter where there were two teams and mechanically, like balance wise, numbers wise, math wise, the two teams should be exactly as powerful, even though the one team had a machine gun that shot bullets continuously and the other one had sort of like a burst rifle that shot like three bullets at a time. um, and they technically should be identical in power, right? The burst weapon shot higher damage, so they should be the same. But the team with the burst weapon, I think, was doing much better because they were playing much more aggressive, and the game was rewarding that aggression. So they put a designer on that to fix it, and they were pretty close to release. And that designer found that the burst rifle had like a very satisfying like sound, while the machine gun sounded a little bit like, and it just that sound made people less aggressive, and it turned the game from this even fight between opposing forces into this team destroying the other team because they felt their guns were stronger than the people playing on the other team. So they just added a little bit of bass to the sound effect, and it fixed the game. Now it had a soul again, right? Everything in that game works. The graphics work, the characters work, the weapons work, the art style worked. Everything worked except for that one sound effect. So close to the heart of this game, to even teams fighting each other. Um, so Soul is hard. Soul is really hard. Some of the best developers make soulless games sometimes, but I think as long as you think about your models, you think about where the heart of your game is, and you are sincere about that, you're genuine about it, you care about the game, you have a much higher chance of protecting it. And when you find it, when you see it, protect it, protect it at all costs.
Very well. I think we still have a lot of questions, but we are running out of time. We already started a bit late.
Yeah. If anybody has any other questions that they want to ask me and they can't do it here because we're out of time, feel free to DM me on Twitter, THA_Rami, RAMI. That's THA_Rami. You can DM me at any time. If you want a bit of a longer phone call, you can do that as well. If you look at my Twitter profile at the top, there's a way to request a short phone call with me. So if you have questions that we couldn't answer here, if you have questions that you don't want to ask in public because they're about a game that you're working on that's still secret or something, feel free to do either of those, and I'll be happy to answer them at that point. Would have loved to be there to just do that in person, but
That
since
would
this
be
year is
great.
this year, we'll do it this way.
Okay, so thank you very much once again for being here. We'll link your Twitter on the chat.
Of course.
And see you soon. We still have a major talk on Friday. On Friday,
Yes.
no, on Thursday. Sorry. So we'll be talking
Yes,
about
Thursday.
many things with Rami and Jesus Fabre. Be around. It will be a nice conversation about indie games and where we are at. So
I'm very excited for it.
thank you. Have a nice one. Bye bye. Okay, we're off.
Okay, awesome.